Imagine waking up at dawn, with the scent of dried herbs and rotting roots filling the air. Your shop? A cramped, cluttered room with shelves lined with jars containing everything from powdered bones to strange-smelling tinctures. Your job? To heal the sick, or at least try, while knowing that one misstep could make your patient worse or even kill them. You are a medieval apothecary, and your world is equal parts science, superstition, and sheer terror. Today, we're stepping into that world where curing a headache might require garlic, vinegar, or a prayer, and a hint of luck. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can travel through history with us again. From plague doctors to royal physicians, from herbalists to surgeons with questionable methods, we're exploring the quirkiest, darkest, and most fascinating corners of medical history. All right, take a deep breath, and let's step into the apothecary's shoes, where every potion is a gamble, and every day could be a life or death adventure. Step into the narrow, winding streets of a medieval town, where the smell of wood smoke and livestock mingles with the sharp, pungent aroma of herbs hanging from shop beams. Here, tucked between the blacksmith and the baker, sits the apothecary's shop, a small, crowded space, darkened by soot-streaked windows and cluttered with jars, bottles, and bundles of dried plants. You might hear a faint sizzle from a pot on the hearth, a bubbling concoction that promises to soothe fever, ease pain, or, if you're unlucky, cause an unexpected, well, let's just say, surprise. Welcome to the world of the medieval apothecary, a place where science, superstition, and a dash of fear coexist under one low, timbered ceiling. By the 12th century, towns across Europe were beginning to recognize the necessity of apothecaries. Long gone were the days when monasteries were the sole keepers of medical knowledge. While monks still preserved manuscripts and cultivated medicinal gardens, the growing urban population created demand for specialists who could prepare remedies outside the cloistered walls of abbeys. Cities needed healers who could serve not only the wealthy, but also merchants, artisans, and even the occasional peasant who managed to scrape together a coin or two. These apothecaries were tasked with creating medicines from herbs, minerals, and occasionally the more exotic ingredients imported along burgeoning trade routes from the Middle East and Asia. They weren't just pharmacists. They were educators, chemists, and, in many ways, magicians, wielding a knowledge that balanced precariously between empirical observation and mystical tradition. Socially, apothecaries occupied a fascinating position. They were respected, sometimes feared, members of the community. Everyone from the lord of the manor to the grocer relied on their skills. Yet nobody truly understood what happened inside those dark, cramped shops. Were they scientists experimenting with nature's bounty? Or sorcerers dabbling in forbidden arts? Right? The line between miracle and menace was thin, and public perception often teetered between awe and suspicion. An apothecary who successfully healed a child or cured a fever could earn gratitude, reverence, and a modest income. Fail once, however, and whispers of witchcraft, incompetence, or ill intent could circulate quickly, fueled by fear and a society that prized superstition almost as highly as skill. The responsibilities of an apothecary were vast, multifaceted, and exhausting. Each day began early, long before the town bells rang. With the selection and preparation of ingredients, roots were chopped, dried flowers crushed, and oils infused for the day's remedies. Sometimes a patient arrived before dawn, an elderly neighbor with gout, a merchant with a cough, or a child with stomach cramps, and the apothecary had to improvise, combining knowledge of humoral theory with practical observation. One dose too strong, and a stomach might rebel violently. Too weak, and the patient remained sick. Precision, intuition, and patience were constantly tested. Apprentices watched silently, learning the ways of mixing powders, preparing poultices, and navigating the tricky social interactions that were as much a part of the job as the herbs themselves. Apothecaries were also responsible for advising their patients, which required careful diplomacy. Imagine someone rushing in, red-faced with anxiety, demanding a cure for what they insist is a plague. Even though it's probably just a mild fever, the apothecary must calm, diagnose, and treat, all while managing the expectations and fears of a panicked public. Yes, it was part science, part psychology, and part theater. They had to appear confident, knowledgeable, and trustworthy because the moment a patient doubted, the apothecary's reputation could crumble like a poorly baked loaf of bread. Teaching apprentices added another layer to their daily life. These young learners were a mix of eager curiosity and dangerous clumsiness. Some dropped jars of precious tinctures, others misread recipes, and nearly set the shop ablaze with overheating cauldrons. Yet apprentices were essential. They were the ones who would continue the craft, passing knowledge along to the next generation. Instruction wasn't formalized in the modern sense. It was often hands-on, with the master explaining while the apprentice watched and mimicked. Sometimes, the lessons included stern warnings about what not to do. Do not add the powdered viper's fang to the ointment without first roasting it over a slow flame. Otherwise, the patient might vomit in ways you won't like. And yes, that could be your fault. Maintaining rare and exotic ingredients was another constant concern. Spices like saffron, imported from distant lands, were expensive and prone to theft. Dried mandrake roots were carefully secured because they were considered both potent and magical. A single misplaced vial could be disastrous financially, and sometimes legally. Town authorities were wary of poisoning incidents, so apothecaries had to balance accessibility with control, always aware that their reputation could hinge on a single accident or rumor. Public perception of apothecaries was equally nuanced. For some, they were miracle workers. For others, they were charlatans. Tales of apothecaries concocting love potions, curing fevers with enchanted amulets, or even summoning spirits to diagnose illnesses were part of everyday gossip. Yeah, people genuinely believed these things. Some townsfolk treated apothecaries with awe, leaving gifts of coins, bread, or homemade beer as tokens of gratitude. Others approached with skepticism or fear, muttering about witchcraft or unnatural arts. For an apothecary, managing these perceptions was just as important as managing their remedies. One had to cultivate respect while avoiding the wrath of both authorities and fearful citizens. A delicate balancing act that required intelligence, patience, and a thick skin. Apothecaries also filled roles that extended beyond the immediate town. They often supplied nearby monasteries, assisted local physicians, and contributed to the education of young surgeons. In some cases, they even acted as the first line of public health advisors, helping towns understand and respond to outbreaks. Of course, this often placed them in morally and emotionally taxing situations. Right? One day, they could be providing a cure for a sick child. The next, trying to calm a crowd-fearing plague. Every action carried risk, not only for the patient, but for the apothecary's livelihood, and occasionally, their life. Humorous observation? Oh yes, there's always a little levity hidden in the chaos. Imagine people expecting you to cure a plague with a bit of rosewater and a few rabbit's feet. Yeah, just another Tuesday. Between the meticulous measurements, the endless grinding of herbs, and the ever-present risk of being blamed for a failed cure, an apothecary's life was both exhausting and absurd. Yet, somehow, they persevered. They learned to laugh quietly at the ridiculous requests, the awkward mistakes, and the constant tension between superstition and science. So, in sum, the medieval apothecary was an essential, fascinating, and terrifying figure in the urban landscape. They occupied a unique social niche, respected for their knowledge, feared for their power, and constantly navigating a world where medicine was more art than science. Their days were filled with grinding herbs, negotiating with patients, instructing apprentices, and maintaining a reputation that could crumble overnight. They were part healer, part magician, part teacher, and part actor, performing a daily ritual that balanced life, death, and community trust. Stepping into their shoes, we can glimpse the complexity of medieval urban life and the precarious role that knowledge played in society. These men and women were pioneers of their craft, bridging the gap between superstition and science, and laying the foundations for the modern pharmacy. Yet, their existence was never simple. Every day was a negotiation with mortality, morality, and human expectations. And through it all, the apothecary endured, grinding, mixing, advising, and sometimes surviving the strange, unpredictable, and often dangerous demands of a medieval town. All right, okay, let's step deeper into the world of the medieval apothecary. Imagine walking into a cramped shop, shelves groaning under the weight of jars, pouches, and dried bundles. The air is heavy, a mix of aromatic herbs, pungent roots, and, well, something that smells like it was dug straight out of the swamp. But don't wrinkle your nose too hard. This is medicine, sort of, in the medieval sense. Every smell tells a story. Every ingredient has a purpose, and every misstep could mean the difference between curing a patient or sending them straight to the grave. Yeah, right? Not much room for mistakes here. First, the sourcing of ingredients. Apothecaries didn't just pop into a local store for pre-made powders. Oh no, they were constantly sourcing plants, minerals, and occasionally animal products from the markets, apothecary fairs, or even foraging in nearby forests. Some roots were considered commonplace like burdock or dandelion, easy to gather and fairly safe. Others were rare, exotic imports. Cinnamon from faraway lands, myrrh, camphor, and other spices that could cost more than a poor laborer earned in a month. And then there were the ingredients with a reputation for danger. Belladonna, hemlock, mercury, and arsenic. Yes, arsenic. Slaves, apprentices, and even the apothecaries themselves had to handle these with care, because a pinch too much could turn a healing potion into a lethal brew. Yeah, just another Tuesday, right? Preparation was an art form, combining skill, knowledge, and a touch of superstition. Remedies came in many forms. Decoctions boiled over gentle flames, salves rubbed into aching joints, tinctures steeped in alcohol for weeks, and poultices applied to wounds. The apothecary had to measure each ingredient precisely, or the potion could fail, or worse. Many remedies required subtle timing, like harvesting herbs at certain phases of the moon, drying flowers in a specific order, or grinding powders with ritual precision. People really believed that astrology and timing could influence the potency of a treatment. Sure, it sounds strange now, but back then, the stars, the seasons, and the humors all mattered. If the patient didn't get better, maybe Mercury was in retrograde, right? That was often a convenient excuse for failure. Some remedies were straightforward. Even logical herbal infusions for a cough, garlic for infections, honey for wounds. But others leaned heavily on superstition. Patients might be instructed to wear charms around their necks, hang garlic in the window, or carry a small talisman to ward off illness. Bloodletting, perhaps the most infamous practice, was considered essential for balancing the humors. If you had too much blood, or too much bile, or black bile, or phlegm, well, a few leeches or a carefully placed incision could reset your internal balance. And sometimes it worked, probably more from the placebo effect than any actual science. Still, it was a standard treatment, and it had the advantage of making patients feel like something was being done. Safety, or rather the lack of it, was a constant concern. Toxic ingredients were a reality, and spoiled potions could be just as dangerous as failing to treat the illness. Herbs could rot, alcohol could sour, minerals could react in unpredictable ways. Apprentices often learned by trial and error, sometimes unintentionally poisoning themselves or causing minor explosions in the shop. Parents would shake their heads as their children sniffed powdered roots or crushed dried leaves, oblivious to the fact that a cough syrup could contain just enough toxic substance to induce vomiting or worse. Yeah, natural didn't always mean safe. Let's talk about workflow for a moment. The apothecary might start the day selecting ingredients for several patients, grinding roots with a mortar and pestle, simmering decoctions, and carefully stirring salves with a wooden spatula. Labeling was rudimentary, often a small handwritten note on parchment, a wax seal, or sometimes just the memory of which jars contained what. Mixing, measuring, and maintaining consistency required constant attention. You couldn't just shake things in a jar and hope for the best. Precision was literally life or death. Imagine juggling that while a worried mother paces the floor, a merchant coughs in the corner, and a curious apprentice keeps sneezing into the powders. Yeah, it's stressful. And of course, every step carried risk. Some ingredients were powerful poisons if mishandled. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, could treat certain conditions in minute doses, but paralyze or kill if overused. Mercury could be used to treat skin conditions and even cures for some illnesses. But prolonged exposure often led to tremors, hallucinations, and eventually death. Arsenic, ironically, found a dual use, a treatment for disease and a weapon for those with less scrupulous intentions. So, you see, the apothecary had to be meticulous, constantly vigilant, and, honestly, a little bit brave. Public perception added another layer of complexity. People were simultaneously reliant on and suspicious of the apothecary. They marveled at the ability to create remedies from roots, powders, and a dash of magic. But they also whispered about the strange smells, the bubbling liquids, and the jars labeled with words they couldn't understand. Did the apothecary heal with science or sorcery? Nobody knew for sure. Right? That ambiguity gave apothecaries both power and danger. One misstep, one accusation of poisoning or witchcraft, and suddenly your day of carefully preparing poultices might end in public shame or worse. Humor, of course, found its way into the daily grind. Apprentices often played pranks with harmless herbs, sprinkling petals in the wrong jar, or mixing bitter roots into mild remedies. Master apothecaries would scold, but secretly, there was a rhythm to the chaos, a strangely comforting sense of order within disorder. And yes, the smell. Oh, the smell. Sure, it smells like a swamp in here, but hey, at least it's medicinal, they'd joke. Behind the laughter, though, was an understanding that they were doing work that mattered, work that kept the community alive, even if it sometimes involved a touch of theatrics. The medieval apothecary also had to navigate the market. Selling remedies to patients involved negotiation, persuasion, and reputation management. Haggling was common, and some customers were notoriously skeptical. Will this actually cure my gout? Or is it just a fancy leaf in a jar? They'd ask. The apothecary had to maintain authority, explain the preparation, and, occasionally, offer reassurance that their blend of ingredients, sometimes as bizarre as powdered deer horn or crushed coral wood, in theory, help. Confidence mattered as much as the remedy itself. Supply chains could be precarious. Herbs and exotic ingredients often traveled from far-off land spices, arriving via Mediterranean trade routes. Roots dug from distant hills, minerals mined across treacherous terrain. Any delay could disrupt treatments, leaving the apothecary scrambling for substitutions or improvising entirely new concoctions. And when a rare ingredient was unavailable, patients sometimes resorted to superstition, blaming bad luck, the stars, or personal sins for their continued ailments. Yeah, it wasn't just science. It was psychology, theater, and magic all rolled into one. Teaching apprentices remained a central responsibility. Every day was an opportunity to pass on skills, from identifying herbs in the garden to mixing tinctures over open flames. Apprentices were trained to respect the delicate balance between efficacy and toxicity, understanding folklore as well as practical science. They learned patience, precision, and, above all, the importance of reputation. A single mistake could tarnish a master's credibility and, occasionally, harm a patient. The lessons were harsh, but necessary. Survival in the apothecary trade required both knowledge and dexterity. By the end of a long day, apothecaries might finally rest, though often their thoughts remained with unfinished remedies or anxious patients. Their work was continuous, cyclical, and, despite occasional humor, incredibly demanding. Each ingredient, each potion, each consultation carried weighty responsibility. The apothecary existed in a delicate balance of science, superstition, and social expectation, walking a line that could just as easily lead to success or scandal. And so, the life of a medieval apothecary immersed in herbs, potions, and rituals was a mix of science and art, diligence and danger, devotion and drama. Their work saved lives, educated communities, and preserved knowledge, even as it operated in a world full of uncertainty, superstition, and occasional absurdity. As they ground their roots, stirred their salves, and consulted their stars, they were at once healers, chemists, and performers, balancing the tangible and the mystical in equal measure. Sure, it smells like a swamp in here, but hey, at least it's medicinal. Just another day in the life of a medieval apothecary. Watch your step. And maybe don't taste everything. All right, okay. Imagine opening the door to your apothecary shop in the early morning, just as the sun struggles to pierce the thick, foggy streets of a medieval town. You take a deep breath, though. Honestly, you probably shouldn't, and brace yourself for the day ahead. Today, like every day, is filled with the nervous shuffling of townsfolk, the demanding glare of nobles, and the whispered pleas of families desperate for any relief from illness. Yeah, right? Another typical morning in the life of a medieval apothecary. Common ailments were numerous, and honestly, sometimes baffling. Fevers were rampant, From simple infections to the terrifying plagues that could sweep through a village in days, cuts and wounds from farm, labor, blacksmithing, or even a clumsy fall in the marketplace were a daily occurrence. Digestive problems, stomach cramps, and mysterious skin rashes filled the shop with patients seeking advice or remedies that might help them survive another week. And of course, there were the plague symptoms, a truly dreaded occurrence, where a combination of fear, superstition, and herbal concoctions was all you could offer. You're expected to diagnose, treat, and provide hope. Some patients are calm and cooperative, an elderly woman clutching a cloth over her forehead, or a child quietly shaking in her mother's arms. Others are more challenging, stubborn nobles who believe their social rank grants them special immunity, or townsfolk who are convinced that your potion isn't strong enough because it lacks a magical charm or a talisman. You have to navigate their expectations carefully. Too cautious, and they accuse you of ineffectiveness. Too daring, and they think you're reckless. Balance is everything. The first step, of course, is assessment. Apothecaries observed symptoms closely, sniffing, pressing, listening, and questioning patients, or sometimes just assuming what the ailment might be based on what the humors dictated. Was it too much blood? Too much black bile? Did Mercury's alignment mean that the fever was likely to worsen? Astrology and the four humors played heavily into every treatment plan, whether you believed it or not. The science of healing was, let's face it, intertwined with superstition. You had to pretend you knew exactly what you were doing while secretly hoping the patient survived long enough for the remedy to work. Yeah. High stakes before breakfast. Preparation of remedies was next. Decoctions brewed over simmering flames, salves mixed with precision, poultices applied with care. Each patient required a slightly different approach, and no two cases were ever identical. You might have a feeble old man who needs a gentle herbal infusion to reduce fever, while the young blacksmith's wound calls for a poultice of honey and herbs to prevent infection. Meanwhile, a child suffering from a digestive ailment might require something as peculiar as crushed coriander seeds mixed with wine. And if you miscalculate, well, let's just say you don't want to imagine that scenario. Interpersonal dynamics were another daily challenge. Patients were nervous, scared, or downright irrational. Mothers clutched their children tightly, muttering prayers and casting worried glances at the apothecary. Farmers grimaced at your jars and powders, convinced that a simple leaf from the forest could cure more than your expensive concoctions. Nobles sometimes demanded immediate results, as if their higher status could bend the laws of nature. And yes, every client seemed to believe that your abilities could cure hiccups, the plague, and heartbreak, all before noon. Yeah, right? The line between healer and charlatan was frustratingly blurry. On one hand, you had extensive knowledge of herbs, preparation techniques, and folk remedies. On the other, so much of your work relied on guesswork, observation, and the mysterious powers of chance. Patients often couldn't tell the difference, and if a treatment failed, it didn't matter whether the potion was prepared correctly, it was your fault. Social trust and reputation were constantly on the line, and a single misstep could lead to rumors of poisoning, incompetence, or even witchcraft. Social pressure. Medieval edition. The emotional toll was heavy. Each patient was a test of skill, patience, and resilience. When a remedy worked, there was satisfaction, fleeting though it might be, because another patient waited. Another family's worry stared at you from the doorway. When it failed, guilt and fear weighed heavily. A child who didn't recover, a peasant who succumbed to fever. These were not abstract numbers. They were human lives, and the responsibility rested squarely on your shoulders. The apothecary's mind was always on edge, juggling both practical and moral dilemmas. Could you have done more? Did you administer the right dose? Did superstition cloud your judgment? Then there were emergencies. Plague outbreaks, accidents at the market, or an influx of travelers brought sudden, chaotic pressure. You might find yourself simultaneously treating multiple patients, mixing potions, and giving advice while an apprentice trips over a basket of herbs, or a noble knocks over a jar of toxic powder. In these moments, time slowed, and every choice mattered. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing. They could be fatal. Despite the stress, there were small ways to manage the chaos. Apothecaries often formed networks, consulting with each other, sharing knowledge about local outbreaks, or trading ingredients for mutual benefit. Apprentices became invaluable, running errands, fetching herbs, and keeping meticulous notes of treatments and outcomes. Camaraderie with fellow healers provided emotional support, a brief respite from the relentless pressure of daily work. Humor, naturally, had a role. Medieval apothecaries had to laugh at the absurdity of some situations. A patient might swear their headache required a frog's gall, or insist that a mysterious rash was a curse from the neighboring sorceress. You had to play along, nodding solemnly while carefully preparing a practical remedy in the background. Yes, madam. The frog's gall is indeed potent, in theory. Let's also apply some honey, just to be safe. This blend of seriousness and subtle mockery helped maintain sanity amid the intensity. Public perception added complexity to the daily grind. Townsfolk were both reliant and suspicious. They marveled at your knowledge, trusted your judgment, yet whispered about the mysteries in your shop, the jars with unidentifiable powders, the strange aromas, the occasionally suspicious ingredients. Rumors of witchcraft or charlatanry could appear overnight, and an apothecary had to carefully navigate both trust and fear. Reputation was everything. Without it, clients would disappear, and livelihoods could collapse. The daily routine was rigorous. Mornings began with assessment, diagnosis, and preparation of remedies. Afternoons were consumed by applying treatments, observing patient reactions, and documenting outcomes. Evening often involved preparing supplies for the next day, sourcing ingredients, and instructing apprentices. The pace was relentless, with little room for rest, but necessary for both survival and professional success. And then there were the unexpected emergencies-poisoned victims, frantic nobles, or panicked villagers during outbreaks. Each required immediate attention, critical thinking, and rapid preparation of remedies. The apothecary had to switch from methodical preparation to improvisational problem-solving in an instant. A misplaced root or incorrectly brewed potion could make the difference between life and death. In essence, the medieval apothecary's daily grind was a blend of medicine, psychology, and performance. They were scientists constrained by superstition, caregivers weighed down by responsibility, and performers navigating the expectations of both the fearful and the skeptical. Life was unpredictable, messy, and often dangerous, but also fascinating, as each day brought new challenges, new lessons, and the occasional success to remind them why they persisted. Your client thinks you can cure hiccups, the plague, and heartbreak, all before noon. Yeah, just another morning in the life of a medieval apothecary. Grab your mortar and pestle and pray for luck. Ah, the medieval apothecary shop, a place of mystery, magic, and constant aromatic chaos. But of course, no apothecary could survive without apprentices. Yeah, right? These young, eager, and sometimes slightly terrified assistants were the lifeblood of the shop. They carried ingredients, ground roots, cleaned mortar and pestle, and, perhaps most importantly, absorbed centuries of accumulated knowledge from their masters. But let's be honest, learning the ropes wasn't just about fetching herbs. It was a delicate, dangerous, and exhausting process. Knowledge transfer in the medieval apothecary was a careful balance of tradition and observation. Sure, you could have a few handwritten notes, but most of the trade was passed orally. A master would demonstrate how to grind a root, steep a flower, or prepare a tincture, and the apprentice would repeat it, sometimes dozens of times, until it was ingrained. Mistakes were part of the process, and in some cases, mistakes could be lethal. Imagine spilling a toxic herb into a patient's potion because you misheard the instructions. Oops. Yeah. Lesson learned, right? Guilds played a critical role in regulating the apothecary profession. They established rules, codified procedures, and maintained standards for training apprentices. Joining a guild was essential if you wanted recognition, legitimacy, and a chance to open your own shop one day. Apprenticeships were formal agreements, sometimes lasting 7 years or more. During this time, apprentices were expected to follow strict routines, obey their masters unquestioningly, and endure long hours of physically demanding and sometimes dangerous work. Apprentices were responsible for almost everything in the shop that didn't involve final consultation with a patient. This included gathering and preparing ingredients, mixing potions, maintaining the inventory of rare herbs, and even brewing the occasional alcoholic remedy. Yeah. Sometimes the apprentice was in charge of wine infusions and tinctures with little more than a cautionary nod from their master. Failure was instructive, sometimes painfully so. A burnt decoction or spilled vial of powdered root wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it could ruin a day's work, or worse, poison a patient. The learning curve was brutal. Apprentices weren't just memorizing recipes, they were developing intuition. They learned to identify subtle differences between herbs, recognize signs of spoilage, and anticipate patient reactions. Observation was key. Watching how a master handled nervous townsfolk, stubborn nobles, or hysterical mothers gave apprentices lessons in psychology as much as pharmacology. And while the master might scold or correct, there was always a subtle nod toward the value of these mistakes. After all, no one became a skilled apothecary without surviving a few disastrous early concoctions. Apprenticeship also demanded courage. Imagine your first encounter with something like powdered wolf's liver, nightshade, or mercury. Yeah, not exactly a risk-free introduction to herbal medicine. Burned fingers, sneezing fits from pungent powders, or near-poisoning incidents were par for the course. And yet, through these trials, the apprentice gained hands-on experience that no book could provide. The reward? Knowledge, skill, and eventually, a reputation that could support a career. The shop itself was a classroom, laboratory, and stage, all in one. Masters taught apprentices by demonstration, by storytelling, and, through careful supervision, every day presented new lessons. Grinding, weighing, measuring, and combining ingredients. Timing decoctions to the minute, adjusting for the season, patient temperament, and sometimes celestial movements. Yep, astrological timing mattered. Mercury was retrograde? Perhaps best to delay that fever mixture. Apprentices absorbed this knowledge slowly, through repetition and a healthy dose of caution. Guilds also provided social structure within the apprenticeship system. Master apothecaries held status in the town, and being associated with a respected master could propel an apprentice toward future opportunities. Conversely, serving under a master known for carelessness or superstition could be damaging. Reputation mattered immensely. An apprentice who learned from a highly skilled and reliable master could someday establish their own shop, attracting clients, gaining guild recognition, and potentially improving their social standing. Apprenticeship wasn't just about technical skill. It also involved learning discretion. Apothecaries held confidential knowledge, both about ingredients and about the townspeople. A noble might confide personal matters while seeking remedies, and gossip spreads quickly. Apprentices had to observe, listen, and learn how to navigate these social dynamics without overstepping their boundaries. In essence, they were learning medicine, trade, and diplomacy simultaneously. The emotional landscape of apprenticeship was challenging. Long hours, high expectations, and constant scrutiny could be demoralizing. Yet, camaraderie often formed among apprentices, especially when multiple young assistants worked in the same shop. They shared stories, warned each other about particularly finicky patrons, and occasionally played subtle pranks to relieve stress. For example, hiding a mischievous frog in a jar of lavender might provide a brief, nervous laugh, though the master's reaction would be another lesson in humility. Safety was an ever-present concern. Some ingredients were outright toxic. Belladonna, arsenic, mercury, and various mineral powders could be fatal if handled improperly. Apprentices had to develop a respect for these substances, understanding their power while learning how to mitigate risks. Protective measures were rudimentary gloves. Careful pouring and a keen eye for accidents were all that stood between a near tragedy and a full-blown catastrophe. Yeah. The stakes were high before lunch. Beyond technical skills, apprentices learned ethics and professional judgment. They observed which treatments worked best, which were placebo, and how to communicate effectively with patients. They learned when to refer serious cases to physicians or when to rely on folk remedies, and, in doing so, became well-rounded healers. The balance between science, superstition, and practicality was delicate. One misstep could ruin a life or a career. By the end of the apprenticeship, those who survived the daily grind, mastered the techniques, and developed a steady hand and sound judgment could expect to gain independence. They could eventually establish their own shops, take on their own apprentices, and perhaps, just perhaps, become respected figures in the town. The reward for years of hard work, Careful observation and occasional mishap was skill, authority, and a place in society that, while limited, offered opportunities for social mobility. You might spill an entire jar of powdered wolf's liver on your apprentice. Oops! Lesson learned. And hey, if you survive that, you might actually learn something valuable about medieval medicine. Step inside a medieval apothecary shop, and you might catch a whiff of crushed herbs, vinegar, or something decidedly less identifiable. Now, picture the person behind the counter, your hands stained with turmeric and soot, your sleeves rolled up, and your mind juggling calculations, cautions, and, the occasional existential panic. Because here's the thing. Every concoction you mix, every poultice you spread, and every elixir you hand over has the potential to cure or to kill. Yeah, no pressure, right? Welcome to the daily reality of the medieval apothecary, where life and death weren't just abstract concepts. They were often literal measurements of your skill and judgment. Legal and moral responsibilities weighed heavily on the apothecary's shoulders. While the law in many towns was murky, the consequences of a botched treatment could be severe. If a patient died after taking your potion, whether due to an ingredient, miscalculation, contamination, or natural disease progression, it could bring both public scrutiny and legal trouble. Town councils and guild authorities often acted as judge and jury. They examined records, questioned apprentices, and sometimes summoned witnesses from the market, the church, or even rival apothecaries. It was a high-stakes balancing act, where a moment of carelessness could result in fines, confiscation of ingredients, or, in extreme cases, imprisonment. Yeah, medieval justice had a flair for drama. Apothecaries didn't just contend with the law. They navigated rivalries with other healers. Quack doctors, wandering herbalists, and even certain clergy often competed for patients. Some claimed divine insight. Others promoted miraculous cures that were often ineffective or outright harmful. A patient could wander in, convinced by a traveling charlatan that a pink root would cure the plague, or at least improve their complexion. The apothecary had to tread carefully, correcting misinformation without alienating the client, all while maintaining the shop's reputation. Gossip spread fast, and nothing could ruin a day or a career faster than word-of-mouth tales of incompetence, or, worse, poisonings. The constant tension between experimentation and caution defined the apothecary's ethical landscape. Medieval medicine was part science, part superstition, and part guesswork. A healer might know from experience that willow bark could reduce fevers, yet they had no modern understanding of salicylic acid. Mercury, arsenic, and other mineral powders were used to treat ailments ranging from skin conditions to internal maladies, sometimes successfully, often disastrously. The apothecary walked a tightrope, needing to test remedies, monitor patients' responses, and adjust treatments, all while hoping no one got seriously hurt or sued you in front of the town council. Case studies of bizarre remedies highlight the precarious nature of this profession. For example, the mummy powder craze saw apothecaries grinding Egyptian mummies into dust to treat everything from headaches to digestive complaints. Imagine carefully measuring tiny shards of embalmed linen and human tissue, thinking, yeah, this will probably work, right? Sometimes it did, or at least patients claimed it did, which was good enough. Other times, not so much. There are records of apothecaries accidentally poisoning wealthy patrons with miscalculated doses of aconite or belladonna, leading to fainting, vomiting, or, occasionally, death. Each failure was a learning opportunity, or a public humiliation. Another challenge lay in navigating remedies for high-profile clients, like mayors, merchants, or visiting nobles. Their expectations were sky-high, and their patience minimal. Administer a tincture that caused hair loss, or misjudge the potency of a purgative, and suddenly the shop's reputation and possibly your freedom was at stake. Apothecaries had to combine skill, intuition, and diplomacy, reassuring worried patients while secretly praying that no one would collapse mid-potion. And yes, even if the mishap was minor, word traveled fast. A single mistake could be immortalized in gossip for weeks. Humans, of course, are unpredictable, and the apothecary had to factor in patient behavior. Nervous townsfolk often refused to follow instructions, sneezed into poultices, or substituted ingredients on their own. Sometimes, Patients simply lied about their symptoms, thinking they could get a stronger potion or quicker relief. All this required a combination of medical knowledge, psychological insight, and a dash of skepticism. Apprentices learned early that managing human behavior was just as critical as mixing the correct herbs. Ethics extended beyond patient interactions to the sourcing and handling of ingredients. Some substances were rare, expensive, or morally contentious. Should you purchase herbs that were harvested from sacred groves, risking the ire of locals and clergy? Should you sell remedies made with parts of animals considered sacred or taboo? These were daily dilemmas. Apothecaries had to weigh profit, legality, and morality, all while ensuring that their preparations were safe, or at least not outright fatal. The shop itself was a microcosm of ethical practice. Apprentices observed, learned, and often erred under close supervision. Masters would correct them, sometimes with harsh words or, occasionally, physical admonishment. A spilled vial of powdered nightshade wasn't just a mess. It was a lesson in precision, concentration, and the serious consequences of negligence. These high-stakes lessons shaped the next generation of apothecaries, instilling respect for both the craft and the gravity of the work. Social perception of danger added another layer of complexity. Townspeople simultaneously feared and revered apothecaries. To them, the apothecary was a mysterious figure, capable of both miraculous cures and terrifying mishaps. Success brought praise, gratitude, and patronage. Failure brought whispers, accusations, and, in extreme cases, threats of violence. Yeah, sometimes you'd leave the shop at night worried about angry patients or relatives seeking vengeance. The line between healer and scapegoat was thin and often blurred. Apothecaries also navigated ethical tensions within the broader healthcare system. Physicians, barber surgeons, and clergy often overlapped in the provision of care. Each group had its own claims to authority, methods, and ethical standards. Apothecaries had to establish credibility while avoiding professional conflicts that could endanger the shop or the master's license. Negotiating these relationships required tact, intelligence, and a healthy dose of caution. Yes, you accidentally made the mayor's beard fall out. And yes, you'll hear about it for the next month. Your apprentice will hide under the counter, terrified, while you try to explain that yes, it was probably just the aconite and no, you don't normally cause mass hair loss. Life as a medieval apothecary was a continuous negotiation between knowledge, ethics, risk, and human unpredictability. Mistakes were inevitable, danger was constant, and the margin for error was razor thin. But for those who survived, learned from errors, and maintained their reputation, the rewards were substantial. Social standing, economic stability, and for some, the quiet satisfaction of keeping a town alive. Literally. By the end of an apprentice's training, these lessons in responsibility, danger, and ethics became ingrained. They learned not only how to make effective remedies, but also how to navigate the delicate balance of life, death, and public expectation. Surviving in the apothecary world required more than skill. It required wisdom, courage, and a keen sense of both human and chemical behavior. And so, the medieval apothecary operated on the fine line between miracle and disaster, respected and feared, healer and potential harbinger of doom. Every day was a gamble, every patient an experiment, and every ingredient a potential key to life or a very dramatic death. Yeah, just another day at the shop. Imagine stepping out of your apothecary's shop in the middle of a medieval town, and the streets are eerily quiet, punctuated only by the wails of the sick and the bell tolls announcing another death. You've been preparing your remedies all morning, your hands dusted with powdered herbs and your apron stained from tinctures. Yet today feels different. Today, you're not just curing a headache or soothing a rash. You're facing an invisible enemy. Plague. Epidemics were the apothecary's nightmare, the ultimate test of skill, courage, and sanity. And yes, it was terrifying. During outbreaks of the plague, smallpox, or typhus, the apothecary became an essential figure in the community. Yeah. Everyone relied on your knowledge, or at least your potions and advice, because there was no understanding of germs, no modern vaccines, and absolutely no antibiotics. People looked to apothecaries for guidance, protection, and remedies. You were expected to mix powders that could repel disease, concoct fumigations for homes, and advise on preventive measures, all while knowing that your own life was in constant danger. Apothecaries often had to coordinate with physicians and clergy. Physicians would diagnose, though often without the means to treat effectively. Clergy would provide spiritual support, urging prayer, confession, and penance. The apothecary's role straddled the line between science, superstition, and morality. They were expected to offer a tangible solution when, frankly, very few existed. And yet, the town expected results. The mental toll of treating infectious disease was immense. Picture this. Every patient you see could die, and some probably will. You carry buckets of foul-smelling decoctions through crowded streets, visit homes where death has already claimed half the household, and inhale the smells of disease, decay, and despair. Yeah, you're on edge constantly, hyper-aware that one cough or touch could make you the next victim. Sleep is fragmented. Every knock on your door is a potential infection, and every mistake, or even the limits of your knowledge, could result in a life lost, a family devastated, and blame directed squarely at your door. Your apprentices share this burden. They fetch ingredients from the market, often ignoring pleas from frightened townsfolk to keep their distance. They assist in fumigating homes, sweeping away contaminated bedding, and administering tinctures. Each step is a potential exposure. The apothecary's guidance is critical, and the pressure to prevent mistakes is relentless. Right. Mistakes could be fatal for both patient and healer. The approaches apothecaries used to combat disease were, at best, inventive, and at worst, downright dangerous. Herbal fumigation was a common tactic, burning rosemary, sage, and juniper to cleanse homes, hoping to ward off miasmas, the bad air believed to carry disease. You'd instruct families to hang herbs above doors and windows, and perhaps sprinkle vinegar around the threshold. The fumes would often make everyone gag, but hey, at least it felt proactive. Quarantine was another approach, though rudimentary by modern standards. Sick households might be cordoned off, their doors marked with signs warning others to stay away. Apothecaries often advised isolation for those infected, even if the local authorities were inconsistent in enforcing it. During large outbreaks, entire streets or wards could be quarantined. And guess who had to visit the quarantined homes to provide remedies, sometimes under armed guard? Yep, the apothecary. Potions and remedies were prepared with a mixture of herbs, spices, and minerals believed to have protective properties. Garlic, onions, and camphor were thought to repel disease, while concoctions of vinegar, honey, and bitter herbs were administered to treat symptoms. Some apothecaries even recommended baths in herbal decoctions, though most townsfolk couldn't afford such luxury. And yes, some remedies were downright toxic, but the desperation of the population often outweighed caution. Prayer and ritual also played a role in public health. Yeah, you might be mixing a potent salve in one hand while the priest blesses the patient with holy water in the other. The line between science and superstition was blurred. Apothecaries had to navigate the expectations of both the medically inclined and the deeply religious crafting remedies that satisfied the human need for action, even if the efficacy was uncertain. Outbreaks tested the apothecary's reputation like nothing else. If the town survived, you were hailed as a genius, a miracle worker, a master of herbs and remedies. But if the death toll rose, whispers of incompetence, negligence, or even witchcraft began to circulate. Apothecaries could find themselves shunned, accused of poisoning, or blamed for failing to prevent disease. It was a precarious position. Every success bolstered your reputation. Every failure could ruin you socially and professionally. You had to maintain a delicate balance, offer remedies that seemed potent without causing harm, reassure terrified townsfolk without promising miracles, and maintain authority over your apprentices while ensuring they didn't make catastrophic mistakes. It was like juggling flaming torches while walking on a tightrope above a pit of rats and disease. And the townsfolk weren't shy about expressing their opinions. Complaints traveled fast, often with dramatic flourishes. The emotional strain was relentless. The apothecary often watched people die despite every effort, knowing there was little they could do. Each death weighed heavily, especially when patients were children, the elderly, or those they knew personally. Long nights of mixing and fumigating, coupled with the constant fear of infection, created chronic stress. Yeah, many apothecaries developed nervous tics, insomnia, and a persistent sense of impending doom. Yet, despite this, the apothecary was indispensable. People depended on their knowledge, skill, and willingness to face danger. Even when treatments failed, the mere act of tending to the sick was a source of comfort. Townsfolk might never understand the science or lack thereof, but they appreciated the effort, and that in itself was a fragile but real reward. Mask or no mask, either way, you're probably sneezing in someone else's face, medieval style, and your apprentice thinks the plague is catching faster than the common cold, so they run around with buckets of vinegar like it's a sport. Welcome to public health in the 14th century. Hope you brought your nose plugs. Epidemics shaped not only daily life, but also long-term strategies. Apothecaries learned from each outbreak, refining methods, rotating ingredients, and developing rudimentary preventive measures. They became experts not just in medicine, but in logistics, psychology, and social management. Communities relied on them not only for remedies, but for guidance on surviving a world where disease could strike at any time. During massive plagues, apothecaries sometimes organized local efforts, distributing herbs to the poor, advising town councils on sanitation measures, or coordinating with physicians for triage. Yeah, you'd be mixing salves, overseeing fumigations, and simultaneously managing a small army of terrified apprentices, all while keeping one eye on the incoming bell toll that signaled yet another death. The work was exhausting, terrifying, and utterly essential. In the end, the medieval apothecary's role during plagues highlights the intersection of knowledge, fear, and survival. They were not only practitioners of medicine, but stewards of public health, community trust, and moral responsibility. The challenges they faced were immense, the stakes high, and the pressures constant. Yet their persistence, ingenuity, and bravery often saved lives, or at least gave townsfolk the hope they desperately clung to. Yeah, plague or no plague, the apothecary remained at the center of it all, a figure of authority, knowledge, and sometimes mild terror. Daily, they faced the balance of life and death, the unpredictable behavior of humans, and the limits of their own craft. But despite the fear and uncertainty, they endured, adapted, and left a legacy of dedication, resilience, and innovation that would echo through the centuries. Imagine walking into a modern pharmacy today. Bright lights, neatly arranged bottles, pills in uniform shapes, and a friendly pharmacist ready to help. Yeah, it seems pretty civilized, right? Well, let's pause for a moment and think back to the origins of this practice, to a time when medicine, magic, and superstition were entwined like the roots of a mandrake plant in a dark apothecary's cabinet. The medieval apothecary, working with their powders, herbs, and mysterious tinctures, laid the foundation for what would eventually become modern pharmacy. And, oh boy, the path there was anything but neat. The apothecaries of the 12th to 15th centuries were pioneers in practical medicine, yeah, right? Sure, some of their methods would make a modern doctor raise an eyebrow or run screaming, but their systematic approach to preparing remedies was revolutionary for the time. They collected, dried, powdered, and combined herbs with a precision that reflected early chemical experimentation. They documented recipes and remedies, teaching apprentices the subtle differences between, say, chamomile for a fever and chamomile mixed with a pinch of opium for a more serious complaint. This documentation and methodical preparation created an early standardization of treatment. Before apothecaries, people relied mostly on folk remedies passed down orally, which meant the success or failure of a treatment could vary wildly depending on who held the recipe. With written records, careful measurements, and guild oversight, apothecaries introduced a level of consistency that was essential for the development of reliable medicine. Yeah, consistency in a world where one mistake could mean a minor rash or death was a big deal. They also contributed directly to the evolution of pharmacology. By experimenting with combinations of herbs, minerals, and animal products, apothecaries observed effects on the human body. Even when they didn't understand why something worked like willow bark reducing pain, They noticed patterns, recorded outcomes, and refined their methods. This observational approach would, over centuries, evolve into modern pharmacological science. And, let's be honest, some of the weird stuff they tried, powdered bones, bat wings, crushed gemstones, was both terrifying and fascinating. Yeah. Don't underestimate their contribution to the natural sciences. Medieval apothecaries were often the first to cultivate herbs in organized gardens, noting their growth patterns, ideal soil conditions, and seasonal changes. These gardens were living laboratories, sometimes hidden behind high stone walls, where apprentices learned to distinguish deadly plants from medicinal ones. Mistaking a poisonous plant for a harmless one could, and sometimes did, end badly. But every experiment, every careful observation added to the growing body of knowledge about plants and their medicinal properties. Chemical experimentation was also a cornerstone of apothecary work. Mixing, heating, and infusing substances into salves, tinctures, and decoctions required careful attention. Some apothecaries collaborated with early alchemists, and although their goals of transmuting lead into gold were, let's say, ambitious, their experiments laid groundwork for later developments in chemistry. They were exploring reactions, solubility, and extraction processes centuries before the laboratory became what we recognize today. Right. A little trial and error, a lot of explosions, and maybe the occasional minor poisoning definitely part of the medieval learning experience. Apothecaries also had a role in the development of public health. By advising townsfolk on hygiene, quarantine measures, and basic disease prevention, they became early epidemiologists of sorts. Their recommendations, even when intertwined with superstition, often helped reduce the spread of disease. Not perfectly, of course, but better than doing nothing. Observing how infections spread, recording symptoms, and attempting remedies contributed indirectly to the rise of evidence-based medicine centuries later. The medieval apothecary didn't only exist in practice, they lived on in stories, literature, and folklore. Yeah, they were a mix of revered experts and mysterious figures in the public imagination. In plays, poems, and tales, they were sometimes depicted as wise, learned figures dispensing miraculous cures, and other times as eccentric, quasi-magical charlatans who might curse as easily as cure. Shakespeare's works, for instance, reference apothecaries as purveyors of both poison and remedy, highlighting their dual reputation as saviors and potential harbingers of doom. Tales of apothecaries also filled local lore, stories of concoctions that could restore sight, bring love, or even induce sleep for days made apothecaries figures of awe and sometimes fear. Townsfolk might consult them for a minor ailment or a life or death disease, but the apothecary's influence extended beyond health. Yeah. Sometimes they advised on astrology, charms, and spiritual well-being, blurring the line between medicine and mystical practice. Modern medicine owes much to the principles established by medieval apothecaries. They introduced systematic preparation, careful observation, apprenticeship, and the idea of professional accountability, though. Okay, accountability sometimes came in the form of angry nobles or townsfolk, rather than licensing boards. Still, these early lessons about standardization, careful measurement, and documentation remain central to pharmacy and medicine today. Ethically, the apothecary's legacy is complex. They operated in a world without informed consent, without sterilization, and often without understanding the underlying causes of disease. Yet, they attempted to balance caution, experimentation, and public duty. Modern medical ethics has evolved dramatically, but the roots of responsibility, patient care, and diligence trace back to these early practitioners. Learning from both their successes and their failures provides a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. In many ways, apothecaries were the original multitaskers. They were chemists, botanists, quasi-physicians, advisors, and sometimes psychologists, all rolled into one. Yeah. And they often worked long hours, inhaling fumes, handling potentially toxic substances, and managing terrified or demanding clients, all while keeping apprentices alive and the town's expectations in check. The stamina, focus, and creativity required were extraordinary. Next time you take aspirin, thank a medieval apothecary. Or at least don't think about the powdered bat wing it took to get here. Yeah, your modern pill is convenient, safe, and probably tasteless. But centuries ago, people relied on a mixture of herbs, roots, and occasionally questionable animal products. With a side of prayer, modern pharmacists and chemists continue to build on apothecary traditions. The concept of a standardized dispensary, carefully labeled ingredients, and measured doses stems directly from their work. Even the apprenticeship model persists in modern pharmacy training, though thankfully without the risk of spilling wolf liver on a trainee. Apothecaries also contributed to early botanical classification, medicinal plant studies, and pharmacognosy, the study of medicinal compounds derived from natural sources. Their influence extended beyond medicine into education and civic responsibility. They taught apprentices not only the craft of preparing remedies, but also the importance of diligence, record-keeping, and integrity. Right? The combination of knowledge transfer and moral responsibility echoes in today's ethical training for medical professionals. From Chaucer to folklore tales, apothecaries left a mark on storytelling. Their mysterious trade, combining science, superstition, and showmanship, captured imaginations for centuries. They were often depicted as quirky, eccentric, or terrifying figures, capable of both miraculous cures and terrible mishaps. These depictions shaped public perception of medicine for generations, blending respect with fear, a duality that persists even in modern stereotypes of mad scientists or eccentric researchers. So yeah, the medieval apothecary was more than a healer. They were an essential part of the social fabric, the scientific vanguard of their time, and the moral and psychological anchor for the communities they served. Right. They navigated a world of disease, superstition, and high expectations, often under extreme pressure and danger. Their influence can be traced in modern pharmacy, chemistry, botanical science, medical ethics, and even literature. In short, without medieval apothecaries, the path to systematic medicine, pharmacology, and professional healthcare would have been far longer, messier, and much more aromatic. And while we can laugh at powdered bat wings or fumigated streets, their legacy is one of innovation, perseverance, and the enduring human drive to heal, understand, and survive. Okay, let's take a deep breath and step back for a moment. We wandered through the narrow, herb-filled streets of medieval towns, ducked past the smoke of furnaces where apothecaries heated their concoctions, and peeked into the chaotic, fragrant world of powders, roots, and tinctures. Yeah, it wasn't a tidy world, but it was alive, and it was essential. And now, we pause to reflect on what all of this means, not just for the apothecary, but for humanity itself. The life of a medieval apothecary was, to be blunt, a balancing act between brilliance and disaster. One day, you were meticulously grinding herbs to help cure a fever, and the next, you were nervously watching a noble sniff suspiciously at your latest mixture, convinced you'd accidentally poisoned him. Every action carried weight, and yet the stakes weren't just professional, they were deeply personal. Right? A mistake could cost a life, and in a world where disease and injury were constant, that life could be anyone's. The mayor, a child, or even your own apprentice. Apothecaries were resilient, resourceful, and endlessly creative. Imagine managing a cabinet filled with rare herbs from distant lands, powders derived from animals no one in your town had ever seen, and minerals that could either cure or kill, depending on how you measured them. Every day required sharp observation, careful hands, and a mind tuned to detail. And yet, despite all the risks, the apothecary persisted, motivated not by glory or profit alone, but by the human desire to heal, to help, to make sense of suffering. Now, let's talk about survival, because, oh boy, that was a recurring theme. Apothecaries weren't just healers. They were survivors navigating a world where superstition, fear, and ignorance were as common as cobblestones in a marketplace. They had to convince townsfolk that their remedies would help, all while competing with charlatans, cunning quacks, and the ever-watchful clergy. A misstep could mean scandal, social ostracism, or worse. Yeah, running a pharmacy in the 14th century was like trying to juggle flaming torches while riding a donkey through a crowded fairground. Stressful, right? Despite these challenges, the apothecary's work laid a foundation for centuries of scientific progress. The careful observation of symptoms, The precise measurement of ingredients and the systematic documentation of remedies all contributed to what we now recognize as the early roots of pharmacology and chemistry. They tested, failed, and tried again, all in pursuit of solutions for ailments that modern medicine could treat in minutes, or with a simple tablet. Right? That cup of chamomile tea or a swig of diluted opium might seem primitive today, but it was cutting-edge experimentation back then. Let's not forget the human element. The apothecary was a mediator between fear and hope, between the unknown and the possible. When plague swept through a town, when fever racked a child, or when a mother clutched her sick infant, the apothecary's shop was a place where desperation met possibility. They administered remedies, yes, but they also offered reassurance, guidance, and a touch of humanity. In a world where life could change or end, at the drop of a hat, that presence mattered. Yeah. And sometimes their advice was as much about psychology as it was about medicine. A calm voice, a carefully timed charm, or a prayer whispered alongside a poultice could provide comfort that no amount of dried herbs ever could. Of course, we can't ignore the darker, sometimes laughable side of their profession. Okay, yes, powdered bat wings, crushed spider webs, or boiling down a frog to extract its essence might seem absurd to us now. But in the context of their world, these were logical attempts to understand a universe that was mysterious and dangerous. Superstition and science were not mutually exclusive. They were intertwined, like the vines that apothecaries harvested from distant forests. Every misstep, every strange experiment added to the collective knowledge and eventually helped humanity move forward. So yes, you might giggle at the thought of a potion meant to cure hiccups. But hey, it was the same curiosity that centuries later gave us aspirin, vaccines, and modern antibiotics. The apothecary also teaches us about adaptation and teaching. Apprentices learned not only the technical skills of grinding, mixing, and dosing, but also the ethics, patience, and attention to detail necessary for survival. Every spilled jar, every minor burn, and every accidental sneeze was a lesson. Right? Learning medicine in those days wasn't a simple classroom exercise. It was hands-on, high-stakes education, often with real human lives involved. And yet, through it all, the knowledge passed down from master to apprentice ensured continuity, eventually influencing generations of healers. What does this all mean for us today? Well, it reminds us how far we've come, doesn't it? Modern medicine-sterile hospitals, precise dosages, scientifically tested drugs is light years away from a medieval apothecary's workshop. But the human drive to understand disease, alleviate suffering, and experiment with potential cures is the same. That curiosity, courage, and commitment to learning survive in every pharmacist, nurse, and doctor working today. Yeah, your modern pill is convenient and safe, but its roots are in the curiosity and resilience of those who dared to mix, observe, and learn when the stakes were life and death. It's also a lesson in humility. We often think of history as a collection of facts and dates, but the lived experiences of people like apothecaries remind us that history is messy, complex, and profoundly human. The stench of herbs, the fear of accidental poisonings, the long hours grinding roots under dim candlelight, all of these details reveal not just the history of medicine, but the history of human resilience. Yeah. They remind us that survival, creativity, and dedication are timeless human qualities. So as we close our journey through the medieval apothecary's world, let's carry a few reflections. 1. Medicine has always been a mixture of observation, experimentation, and courage. 2. Knowledge grows through persistence, mistakes, and careful mentorship. 3. Even in the most challenging, frustrating, or bizarre circumstances, humans are capable of incredible ingenuity and compassion. And yes, 4. Powdered bat wings are probably optional today. Before you head off into the modern world of comfortable pharmacies and prescription pads, take a moment to reflect. Think about the people who labored in candlelit shops, who risked poisoning, ridicule, and sometimes death to understand the human body and alleviate suffering. Appreciate the science, the trial and error, the courage, and yes, even the humor hidden in their mishaps. It's a perspective that makes your modern aspirin, antibiotic, or vitamin pill feel a little more miraculous, doesn't it? And hey, If you enjoyed this trip into the chaotic, fragrant, sometimes dangerous world of the medieval apothecary, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue exploring more quirky, fascinating corners of history with us, places where science, superstition, and human resilience collide. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe tell us what strange remedy you'd be brave enough or foolish enough to try. Yeah, I'm curious too. So, as you take a deep breath, perhaps sip your tea or coffee, and reflect on the centuries of human ingenuity, let's quietly appreciate both the weird and the wonderful. Because without those apothecaries, without their curiosity, courage, and mistakes, modern medicine might look very different today. And more importantly, without their persistence, we wouldn't fully appreciate the delicate dance between knowledge and survival that has always defined the human experience. Who, right? From powdered roots to polished pills, from superstition to science, from fear to hope, the legacy of the apothecary reminds us of one unchanging truth. Humans have always wanted to heal, to understand, and to survive. And with that, our journey through the strange, aromatic, and endlessly fascinating world of the medieval apothecary comes to an end, at least for now.